There was a time when money felt like the answer to everything. Not just comfort, not just security, but meaning, direction, proof. You told yourself that once you earned enough, things would finally settle. You would relax. You would feel accomplished. You would stop worrying. You would become someone. And for a while, chasing money felt logical, necessary, almost virtuous. It gave structure to your ambition and urgency to your days. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Quietly, subtly. You didn't announce it. You didn't quit dramatically or renounce the world. You simply stopped chasing. And even if you can't fully explain it yet, you know it's true. You don't chase money anymore. And the reason why has very little to do with laziness, failure, or lack of ambition. At first, you might have thought something was wrong with you. Everyone else seemed obsessed, hustling harder, grinding longer, comparing numbers, measuring worth in income brackets. Meanwhile, you felt detached, not bitter, not defeated, just uninterested in the chase the way you once were. The hunger was gone, or at least transformed into something quieter. And that absence confused you, because for a long time, chasing money was how you made sense of effort, progress, and identity. But the truth is, you didn't stop chasing money because you gave up. You stopped because you learned something most people never slow down enough to realize. You learned that money promises more than it delivers. At the beginning, money feels like freedom. It represents choice, safety, control. And in a very real sense, it does provide those things up to a point. But chasing money endlessly creates a subtle trap. The goalpost keeps moving. What once felt like enough becomes baseline. What once felt luxurious becomes normal. And the satisfaction you expected never quite arrives. It's always postponed to the next milestone, the next raise, the next level. You notice this pattern, maybe without naming it at first. You saw people who had made it still anxious, still restless, still comparing, still afraid of losing what they had. The lifestyle improved, but the inner state didn't stabilize. And that observation planted a quiet doubt in you, a doubt that grew every time you achieved something financially and felt underwhelmed. You realize that money solves problems, but it also creates new ones, different ones, sometimes quieter, sometimes heavier. The pressure shifts from survival to maintenance, from scarcity to fear of loss. And that fear can be just as consuming as the fear of not having enough. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you began to notice the cost, not just in hours worked, but in attention, presence, and energy. Chasing money aggressively often requires constant future orientation. You're always thinking ahead, planning, optimizing, sacrificing now for later. And while short-term sacrifice can be meaningful, living perpetually in that mode disconnects you from the present. You started to feel that disconnection. Moments passed without being fully lived. Conversations half heard. Days blurred together. You were productive but not present. And at some point, you asked yourself a question that changed everything. What is the point of earning a life you don't have time or energy to experience? That question doesn't come from irresponsibility. It comes from clarity. You also began to understand that money is a tool, not a purpose. When it becomes the purpose, everything else becomes instrumental. Relationships become networks, interests become monetizable, time becomes billable, even rest becomes strategic. And slowly, without intending to, life turns into a transaction. You felt that shift, and something in you resisted it. Not because money is bad, but because reducing life to economics felt wrong, too narrow, too small for what you sensed life could be. Another layer of this realization is psychological. Chasing money often masks deeper needs: validation, security, control, belonging, worth. When you're younger, it's easy to believe that money will finally silence those needs. That once you earn enough, you'll feel confident, respected, safe. But experience taught you otherwise. You may have earned more and still felt uncertain, still questioned your worth, still felt restless. That's when it became clear that money doesn't resolve internal conflicts. It amplifies them. If you don't feel enough without money, no amount will permanently fix that feeling. It might distract you for a while. It might numb the question, but it doesn't answer it. At some point, you stopped wanting distraction. You wanted alignment. You also began to notice how chasing money shapes behavior. It encourages comparison. There's always someone earning more, doing better, scaling faster. This comparison never ends because the ladder has no top. Someone is always ahead. And chasing money keeps you looking sideways instead of inward. You realized how exhausting that was. Comparison doesn't inspire forever. Eventually, it drains. It turns ambition into anxiety, progress into pressure. And for someone who values depth, meaning, or autonomy, that pressure becomes unbearable over time. So you stepped back. Maybe not consciously at first. Maybe you just felt less motivated by numbers alone, less impressed by income headlines, less willing to sacrifice peace for prestige. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you discovered a different kind of wealth. Time, attention, autonomy, health, emotional stability. These don't show up on bank statements. But once you've experienced their absence, you realize how valuable they are. You noticed that people with high incomes but no time were trapped in a different kind of scarcity. That people with status but no inner peace were paying a hidden price. And you began to value sustainability over acceleration. This doesn't mean you stopped caring about money altogether. It means you stopped worshiping it. There's a difference. You still understand money's role. You still want enough. You still value stability. But you no longer believe that more automatically means better. You no longer believe that your worth is tied to your earning potential. And that belief alone changes how you move through the world. Another quiet shift happened when you realized how much chasing money narrows identity. When income becomes the primary metric, everything else becomes secondary. Curiosity, creativity, play, exploration, rest. These get postponed or dismissed as unproductive. But at some point, you felt the absence of those things. Life felt efficient, but not alive. Structured, but not meaningful. And you understood that a life optimized solely for earning is not a life optimized for being human. You may have also noticed that the people who talk the loudest about money often seem the least satisfied. Constantly hustling, constantly justifying, constantly signaling success. And you sensed that if money truly delivered peace, they wouldn't need to talk about it so much. That observation didn't make you cynical. It made you cautious. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've likely experienced burnout, or at least brushed up against it. Pushing hard for financial goals often requires ignoring internal signals. Fatigue, disinterest, emotional depletion. Over time, those signals get louder, and when they're ignored long enough, the body or mind forces a pause. That pause changes perspective. You realize that no amount of money is worth chronic exhaustion, that health is not something you can fix later, that recovery is not guaranteed, and that the ability to enjoy what you earn depends entirely on your capacity to be present. You may not have articulated it this way, but something in you decided, I don't want a life that requires constant recovery. You also began to understand how much chasing money is driven by external narratives. Cultural expectations, family scripts, social media comparisons, definitions of success handed down without question. When you stepped back, you started asking yourself whether those definitions actually belonged to you, and many of them didn't. You didn't stop chasing money because you lacked ambition. You stopped because your ambition matured. It became less reactive, less performative, less externally defined. You started wanting work that felt meaningful, not just lucrative. A pace that felt sustainable, not just impressive. A life that felt coherent, not just successful on paper. This shift often feels lonely because it puts you out of sync with a world obsessed with growth metrics. But it also feels relieving because you're no longer running someone else's race. If this resonates, it's because you're not rejecting money. You're rejecting the lie that money is the ultimate measure of a life. Staying connected to reflections like this helps you resist being pulled back into that lie when the noise gets loud again. And staying subscribed isn't about anti-wealth thinking. It's about clarity in a culture that confuses accumulation with fulfillment. Another subtle reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've seen how it distorts motivation. When money becomes the main driver, intrinsic interest erodes. You stop doing things because they matter and start doing them because they pay. Over time, this drains joy from work and turns passion into obligation. You may have felt that shift personally. Something you once loved became transactional, and you realized that preserving meaning required loosening money's grip on your decisions. You also noticed that financial success often increases expectations from others, from yourself. More responsibility, more pressure, less margin for error. The freedom you expected sometimes came with new constraints, and you learned that not all forms of freedom are created equal. The freedom to choose your time, your energy, your boundaries often matters more than the freedom to buy more things. Another realization that changes everything is this: chasing money postpones life. There's always a future point where you tell yourself you'll slow down, enjoy more, be more present. But that future point keeps moving. Life doesn't wait politely for you to arrive. It happens now, whether you're ready or not. You felt that truth at some point. Maybe during a quiet moment, maybe during loss, maybe during stillness. And once you felt it, you couldn't unfeel it. So you adjusted. You started asking different questions, not how much does this pay, but what does this cost me? Not will this impress, but will this sustain? Not is this scalable, but is this livable? Those questions changed your trajectory. You may also have realized that chasing money can be a form of avoidance, staying busy, staying driven. Staying focused on numbers can keep deeper questions at bay. Questions about meaning, identity, fulfillment. When you stop chasing, those questions surface. And while they can be uncomfortable, they're also honest. You didn't stop chasing money because you didn't know what else to chase. You stopped because you were ready to ask better questions. There's also a moral dimension that often emerges with maturity. You start noticing how systems reward certain behaviors and punish others. How not all money is earned equally. How value and compensation are often disconnected. This awareness complicates the chase. It makes blind pursuit feel naive. You didn't become anti-success. You became discerning. And that discernment shows up as restraint. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've learned to distinguish between enough and excess. Enough brings relief. Excess often brings complication. More decisions, more maintenance, more anxiety, more attachment. You realized that beyond a certain point, returns diminish, but costs keep rising. So you optimized for enough. That choice doesn't make you small. It makes you precise. You may still work hard, still aim high, still care about quality and impact, but your motivation has shifted from accumulation to alignment, from proving to building, from chasing to choosing. And that shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes everything. People might misunderstand you. They might think you've settled, lost ambition, opted out. But what they don't see is that you've opted into a different definition of success, one that includes your nervous system, your relationships, your inner life. You no longer want to win at the cost of yourself. If you're still listening, it's because this perspective resonates with something you already feel, but maybe haven't fully articulated. Staying connected to ideas like this keeps that clarity alive. Subscribing isn't about rejecting money or success. It's about remembering why you stopped letting them define you. In the end, You don't chase money anymore because you've learned that money is a means, not a meaning. Because you've seen what it can and cannot do. Because you value wholeness over wealth alone. Because you understand that the richest life is not the one with the highest income, but the one with the deepest alignment. You didn't stop chasing money because you stopped wanting more. You stopped because you started wanting better. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've begun to sense how tightly it tries to bind identity. When money is the primary metric, you don't just earn it, you become it. Your sense of self subtly fuses with your output. Good months feel like self-worth. Bad months feel like personal failure. Over time, this fusion becomes psychologically dangerous. Your inner stability depends on external fluctuation. And once you notice that dependency, it becomes hard to ignore. You may have felt this at some point. A dip in income triggering disproportionate anxiety. A financial win bringing only brief relief before the next worry arrived. That cycle revealed something important. Money was no longer just supporting your life. It was regulating your emotions. And that's too much power for any external thing to hold. So you loosened your grip. Not irresponsibly, intentionally. You also began to see how chasing money narrows perception. It trains you to see opportunities only through the lens of profit. Conversations become transactional. Curiosity becomes strategic. Even generosity can become performative. And while this mindset is often praised as smart, it quietly erodes sincerity. You didn't want to live that way anymore. You started craving sincerity. Conversations without agendas, work that didn't need constant justification, time that wasn't always being converted into value. That craving wasn't laziness. It was a signal that something essential had been crowded out. Another subtle shift occurred when you realized how often money chasing is driven by fear, not desire. Fear of falling behind, fear of being irrelevant, fear of disappointing others. Fear of not being respected. When you slowed down enough to examine your motivations, you saw that much of the urgency wasn't coming from joy or curiosity. It was coming from pressure. Pressure is a terrible long-term motivator. It burns hot, then burns out. You may still feel moments of that pressure now and then. Old habits don't vanish overnight, but you no longer obey them blindly. You pause. You ask yourself whether the push is coming from alignment or anxiety. And often, that pause is enough to break the spell. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've likely experienced moments of profound clarity. Moments when money was irrelevant. Moments of connection, of beauty, of loss, of stillness. Moments that reminded you that the most meaningful experiences in life are not bought, scaled, or optimized. Those moments rearrange priorities quietly but permanently. Once you felt deeply present, deeply connected, or deeply aware, it becomes harder to justify sacrificing your life force purely for accumulation. You don't become anti-ambition. You become selective about what ambition is allowed to cost you. You may have also realized that chasing money often delays self-trust. You keep telling yourself, once I reach X, then I'll trust myself. Then I'll relax. Then I'll choose differently. But that moment rarely comes, because trust is not something money grants. It's something you practice. At some point, you stopped waiting for permission. You started trusting your internal signals more than external metrics. You listened when something felt wrong, even if it paid well. You walked away from opportunities that looked impressive but felt misaligned. Those decisions may not have made sense to everyone else, but they made sense to you. That's maturity. Another layer of this shift is that you've likely seen how chasing money distorts time perception. Life becomes segmented into phases of earning and phases of living, with living always postponed. You tell yourself you'll slow down later, enjoy later, be present later. But later is an abstraction. Life only happens now. You didn't want to keep renting your present to a hypothetical future. So you changed how you relate to time. You started valuing days that felt complete, not just productive. You began to care less about speed and more about rhythm. You noticed that a sustainable pace allowed you to think more clearly, feel more deeply, and live more honestly. That rhythm matters. You may have also noticed that the people who chase money the hardest often struggle to stop, even when they have enough, even when they're exhausted. The chase becomes identity. Slowing down feels like death. And seeing that future reflected back at you was sobering. You didn't want to become someone who couldn't rest without guilt. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've likely developed a stronger sense of self. When identity is fragile, money feels like armor. It protects you from judgment, from insecurity, from feeling small. But as identity solidifies, the armor becomes heavy. You no longer need money to tell you who you are. That doesn't mean you reject comfort or stability. It means you don't outsource your worth to your bank balance. You know who you are even when numbers fluctuate. That inner anchoring changes your entire relationship with work and ambition. You might also have realized that chasing money often crowds out experimentation. When every decision has to justify itself financially, curiosity dies. You stop trying things that might fail. You stop exploring paths that don't promise immediate return. Life becomes efficient but predictable, and predictability, while safe, can become stifling. You wanted room to explore again, to follow interest without immediately monetizing it, to learn without pressure to perform. That space is essential for creativity and growth. Money chasing often eliminates it, so you reclaimed it. Another subtle but important realization is that money chasing tends to reward extremes. Overwork, overcommitment, over-identification with success. These extremes are often celebrated, but they're not sustainable. You notice the toll they take on health, on relationships, on inner life. You didn't want to normalize burnout as the price of success, so you quietly redefined what success meant to you. Not as a static destination, but as a way of living that you could maintain without betraying yourself. That redefinition didn't come from theory. It came from lived experience. You also began to understand that financial ambition without emotional maturity often leads to emptiness. You can achieve a lot and still feel unfulfilled if your inner life hasn't grown alongside your outer success. Money can amplify emptiness just as easily as it amplifies comfort. You didn't want amplification, you wanted integration. Integration means your work supports your life instead of consuming it. Your ambition coexists with rest. Your goals align with your values. Your success doesn't come at the expense of your nervous system. This integrated approach looks boring to a culture addicted to spectacle, but it feels right in your body, and that matters more. Another reason you don't chase money anymore is that you've learned to recognize false urgency. Many opportunities are framed as now or never. Hustle culture thrives on scarcity narratives. But with experience, you've seen that truly aligned opportunities don't require panic. They don't demand self-abandonment. You've learned to wait. Waiting is not passivity, it's discernment. You may still pursue financial growth, but you do it on your terms, with boundaries, with clarity, with an understanding of trade-offs. You no longer confuse motion with progress, and that changes everything. People might project their own fears onto you. They might assume you're afraid of success or content with less. But what they don't see is that you're no longer chasing money because you're chasing something more precise. Freedom that doesn't collapse under pressure. Work that doesn't hollow you out. A life that feels coherent, not just impressive. If you're still here, listening to this, it's because you recognize this shift in yourself. You may not have planned it, but it happened. And staying connected to reflections like this helps you hold on to that clarity when old narratives try to pull you back. Subscribing isn't about rejecting ambition. It's about protecting a more honest version of it. In the end, you don't chase money anymore because you've seen behind the curtain. You've seen what money can give and what it can't. You've experienced both hunger and excess. You've learned where money helps and where it distracts. And with that knowledge, you made a quiet decision. You decided that money would serve your life, not define it. That ambition would support your well-being, not override it. That success would feel calm, not frantic. That progress would feel grounded, not desperate. You didn't stop chasing money because you stopped caring. You stopped because you learned how to care better.